This is a piano. To play it, there are three things you need to know: what notes to play, when to play them, and how loud to play them. These others come in handy for other things, but first we'll go over what you need to know. This is the grand staff, better known as sheet music. It tries to show you what you need to know, but it was always imprecise and inefficient, and because of this rendered impossible the simplest desire to just play the piano. Here's why it was so cumbersome. Each set of 5 lines is called a clef. Sheet music usually had 2 clefs, one for the right hand and one for the left. Why the right hand's clef wasn't toward the right instead of up, I'll never know. This looked nothing like a keyboard, and there was no picture or representation of a keyboard at all. Instead, this was all you got. Your only reference was these goofy looking letters. Yes, they're letters. Some say they used to be called the G clef and F clef. The G clef meant that whenever a note straddled this line, you would play this note, and the F clef meant that whenever a note straddled this line, you played this note. They weren't even the same line. This was because the clefs were mirror images of each other rather than copies of each other. For the next note up, the note head was drawn in between lines. The next note up was on a line again. Every note was either on or between lines. Follow the system up until the next F and... oops, we're out of lines. I'll give it an extra one. And notice that this time it's in between lines, instead of on a line like it was before. This is because it uses an even and odd system to house 7 notes. You might already see what I'm getting at, which is, with the grand staff, every note is visually unique, and each note had to be learned and recognized individually. For example, on the keyboard every E looks identical, but on the grand staff, the E in one octave looks nothing like the E of any other octave. To help you learn the notes, a teacher would usually use some stupid mnemonic devices, such as these, which altogether only accounted for 34 out of 88 notes. That's only about 39%. This means the majority of the keyboard was one big exception, requiring things like ledger lines, octave displacements, and clef reassignments. Lines and spaces were never topographic, they only showed the white keys. So this 39% figure is actually down to about a whopping 28%. The black keys were governed by a wildly inefficient system of alterations made to the white keys. These alterations came in 2 forms, and I think they're both largely to blame for prohibiting a student's musical exploration. First, these alterations were shown by what's called a key signature. It's basically a filter that all notes had to pass through. This filter showed up as a pile of symbols at and only at the far left of each clef. The second way these alterations were shown is by what's called accidentals. They were exceptions to the key signature. They were reiterations of it or additions to it, and they were individual symbols that went along with each note. You had to be able to understand them as they showed up and mentally carry each one throughout its measure. I once saw a seasoned concert pianist miss this note while reading, so don't tell me everybody can get used to it. I don't believe it. We'll talk about x-axis juxtaposition later. So let me delete the notes that have an accidental. And for the record, I found this example in less than 1 minute, so this kind of crap was common. And which of these are typos? As you can see, sometimes this key signature just sat in the way and required lots of accidentals, and what you ended up with was just a bunch of ink. Because the notes jetted off horizontally, the flow of the piece was interrupted every page width by a line break. This introduced the annoyances of skipped lines and even losing your place in music. Circular note heads needed to be distinguished as either on or between lines. To avoid having a big, indistinguishable blob on the page, 2 simultaneous side-by-side notes, like these, had to use horizontal juxtaposition rather than vertical, even though we teachers would like to believe that the x-axis was reserved for meter. This juxtaposition set a limit on the amount of x-axis note scrunching that could compensate for quick passages. When that limit had been reached for a measure, its bar lines had to be drawn farther apart, and thus were born irregular intervals on an x-axis. Sheet music, by definition, was paper, and the pages always needed turning. Electronic displays might have helped here, but never did very well with grand staff notation. I think the main reason is this: bar lines don't give the beats. Instead, they divide them, such as beat 4 of one measure and beat 1 of the next measure. the first printed note or rest of a measure was never actually on the bar line itself, but always sometime after. This metrically non-existent gap leaves two unfortunate options for scrolling grand staff displays. They must either cross the bar during beat 4, holding these counts through this gap, or treat all of beat 4 while still within its measure, and then jump the gap to the start of the next measure. The gap jumping option is not just a little jumpy, but necessarily every single measure, while the metric bleed over option can become annoying and even distracting during slower tempos, and slower readers need slower tempos. Note durations didn't stretch. Rests were also forced into existence, and after all the 3-beat rests I heard in 4/4, I dare say they never really worked anyways. Monitoring some pre-existing count cue and placing a new note are two completely different operations, so ties certainly don't fix the problem by confusing the two. You don't play it when it is in fact a new note on the page. Ties are just distracting. Only measures were shown. The beats were never shown. The note heads only gave pitch. Note relationships are printed an octave higher or lower with beams. While there were some principles of metric placement that involved a tiered system of beams, flags, dots, and ties that could show beat divisions and subdivisions, they were very often disregarded. Etudes are usually fast, but it says lento, which means slow. You'd have to teach the student some Italian in order to keep him from peeling out in this piece. What does speaking any Italian, minimal though it may be, have anything to do with playing the piano? Loudness indicators in music are called dynamics. There are dynamics for a passage or a phrase, and dynamics for individual notes. The passage dynamics don't refresh, or in other words, they might be shown once at the beginning of a phrase and that's it. Individual note dynamics have only one dynamic called an accent or a sforzando to indicate louder than the rest. And another thing, I remember being told that you would never have more than 3 P's or F's, but here are 4 P's, and even 5. Make no mistake, it's not very, 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 very soft, it's very, 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 very soft. Often a student didn't know what these letters meant until you played it for them. No matter how often they were told, they had to hear how loud or soft before it did them any good. To remember and create music, then these others come in handy. We'll have to talk about theory in another video. Similar passages, or similes, use shorthand. Exact repeats require even more European translations with their strange counterpart signs. So as the pianist scanned back a page at a time looking for some strange sign because there were no measure numbers, the music had pretty much, stopped. That's never good in music. Technical indicators, or articulations, use even more conventions you have to learn, like dots and dashes. And all kinds of other figures like trills, arpeggios, turnarounds reference even more abstract crap. We have now gone over note finding, note reading, general page layout, overall form of the piece, and any given instructions, and found that sheet music falls short in each of these categories. Are we missing anything? If not, then it is completely fair to say that sheet music falls short in every category. If your teacher isn't doing anything to simplify this, my advice, get a new teacher. If you call yourself a teacher and you aren't simplifying this, shame on you. If you have any comments or suggestions on this video, send them to universityofsteve@gmail.com, subject sheet music. And if you have any complaints, you can bend over